Behind the Crime Scene with Gina Osborne and Tracy Miller. It's April 30th, 2007. Chester Turner is convicted of killing 10 women, including the unborn child of one of his victims. The murders took place within a 4-block radius in the city of Los Angeles between 1987 and 1998. The crime scenes were horrific. 2 women made sure justice was served. Chester Turner received the death penalty twice and is sitting on death row awaiting his fate.
Welcome to Behind the Crime Scene, where we go beyond the yellow tape and into the lives of first responders, investigators, and prosecutors who work true crime. I'm Gina Osborne, retired FBI Assistant Special Agent in Charge and former Army Counterintelligence Agent.
And I'm Tracy Miller. I've been a prosecutor for over 23 years, and I've done over 80 jury trials, including violent gang cases, juvenile sexual assault cases, and domestic violence cases. And we take our show on the road. Gina, you know motivational speaking is my passion, and we've been doing a lot of speaking together lately. We speak to nonprofit groups and businesses and faith-based groups and law enforcement agencies, and we teach them how to connect with their purpose and each other. And we do that by talking about our guests, our life experiences, and the stories and life lessons we've learned from our guests.
And on today's show, we're talking about Chester Turner, who was the most prolific serial killer in Los Angeles County. Do you remember this case?
He killed and would be in broad daylight amongst his victims and the victim's family. And he was so brazen, and the murders were so violent and brutal, and he tortured people before he murdered them.
So on today's show, we have 2 different people. We have Beth Silverman, who has been a deputy district attorney with the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office since 1994, and she's currently assigned to the Major Crimes Division.
That's where I started, Gina. After I worked on OJ at the LADA's office, I worked as a law clerk in the Major Crimes Division, and that's where LADA's office puts their best of their best prosecutors. So it's such an honor to have Beth on our show because she has done some of the biggest cases.
She has, and during the last 11 years in this unit, she successfully obtained the death penalty in several capital cases. So I'm looking forward to talking to her about this case.
And she prosecuted the Grim Sleeper, one of the most famous cases out there. She's definitely very well esteemed in the district attorney's world. Also, I'm really excited because I have someone that's been my friend for a very long time, Jody Hynds. Jody Hynds worked for the Orange County District Attorney's Office for several years, as she worked for us as a senior forensic scientist. And Jody created a genealogy team that looks at DNA and works with DNA to solve cases. She has done DNA analysis for over 20 years in her career. She left us, womp womp, recently, and she moved to Texas, where she is a senior forensic scientist at the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office. And Jody, working with prosecutors, is so passionate and taught us so much about DNA because it is complicated, and taught us how to explain it to jurors. So I'm really excited to have both Beth and Jody on the show today.
Let's go behind the crime scene on the Chester Turner serial killer case.
Welcome to the show, Beth. I'm so excited to have a fellow deputy district attorney on the show, especially someone with as much trial experience as you.
Oh, thank you.
We're really, really interested in talking to you about Chester Turner, but tell us a little bit about how long you've been in the Major Crimes Unit and what that unit is.
I've been in Major Crimes now for close to 14 years, and that's the unit in the LADA's office that handles the complex and sometimes high profile, sometimes not, but complex homicide cases for the county of LA.
And how many homicides had you done by the time you heard the name Chester Turner?
At the time that I tried Chester, I think I had already tried a few other serial killers before him.
And he seemed like he was hiding in plain sight. He worked for Domino's as a cook and was a delivery person, and he killed his own neighbors.
Yeah, which is really not surprising. I mean, that does tend to be the pattern that we see. We saw that again with, the Southside Slayer, and then again with Lonnie Franklin, the Grim Sleeper, where they hunt in their own neighborhoods because that's where they feel comfortable, and that's where they know the back streets and the alleys and, where women congregate, where vulnerable victims congregate. So that's not actually unusual.
What was remarkable about this case for you?
I think, each of these serial cases stand out. So remarkable, I don't know if there was anything that was remarkable, but it certainly was extremely disturbing to see the level of violence that was perpetrated on these women. And I just remember in the case of one particular victim that he had tied her up to some rope and was using the ropes to try to strangle her. And he was stepping on her back in order to pull the rope tight to prevent any slack in the rope. And there was, I just remember, a shoe print on this one particular victim's back from him stepping on her as he was trying to strangle her to death with the rope. And there was something about that one. And then there was another victim who was pregnant at the time. Like I said, he's a monster.
They seemed particularly violent, each of the murders, particularly gruesome. Did you find he was more violent than others?
Yes, in some circumstances. We did have on the Southside Slayer on Michael Hughes, where he did some really horrendous things in terms of the sexual assaults and the trauma to those victims, and then laying those victims out in areas where he thought people, or more likely children, would come across the bodies. But Chester Turner, every single one of his victims, he was just so vicious.
So tell me about my good friend Jody Hynds and what work she did with you on the case. Our mutual good friend, I should say.
That's right, our mutual good friend. I love Jody. I have actually had her testify several times, positions, and brought her in to testify, and she did a lot of the DNA work on this particular case involving Chester Turner. So she came in to testify about her testing and her results and the process.
Let's invite senior forensic scientist Jody Hynds to the conversation.
DNA results from all the different victims were processed years before, because there's a string of victims and their DNA was typed and it was an unknown male for years. And they weren't connected until there was a matching CODIS.
Will you describe what a CODIS hit is and what it means to be typed?
Yes, so CODIS stands for Combined DNA Index System. It is the FBI's DNA database that has convicted offender DNA, and some states also upload arrestee DNA. So there's an index for convicted offenders, and then there is an index for unknown DNA profiles that they don't know the source of the DNA. Those are compared weekly to try to find the source of DNA in unsolved crime scenes. So there was a CODIS hit that connected a string of these victims together, and they were all, typed by different people with very limited information other than they knew it was a sexual assault and a homicide.
So you get this hit, and then what do you do?
So the hit occurs at LAPD's crime lab. They arrest Chester Turner. I don't know this information, but they collect a DNA sample from him. So we just get a file in that says buccal swab, Chester Turner, compared to, and they list all the case numbers that he was connected to. And then you see that, and all it is a buccal swab, and that's just a swab from the inside of your cheek that's a known reference sample that's used for comparison. So now you have to pull files. And at the time, there were 14 victims, and we had to pull the old files, look at the data that was obtained years earlier, and compare his reference sample. So they had me compare the reference sample of Chester Turner to the DNA that was processed earlier for all 14 cases. So that way there would be one consistent name on the report that could testify to all the results. So what I knew was what was on the reports. Most of the samples were anal swab, sperm fraction, vaginal swab, sperm fraction, breast swab, which was saliva. Those type of samples were what I really knew about the case. I didn't know about each individual victim, and that's not something I want to know.
Why?
That's not something I would typically know. As a forensic scientist, I'm involved in the science. I'm involved in what DNA is present and who matches that DNA. And I need to know enough about the case to understand how to process the scientific evidence. But I don't need to know any more than that. I can't go in with any bias of assuming somebody will match because I've read too much and I think, oh yeah, this is the guy. No, that's not my job. My job is to do the science.
What did you testify to while you were on the stand?
I testified to 10 of the victims. I flew to LA with a suitcase full of case files, and I tried to organize the reports in a binder to where I can just flip to whatever victim we're talking about now and what the results were. And I remember looking the defendant in the eye on the stand because I'm sitting up there and I'm unbiasedly providing scientific information, and I'm providing it for the jury. My job is to report the facts and the scientific facts in the case. But like with every victim that you say, you know, the vaginal swab, sperm fraction, matched, Chester-Turner, and here are the statistical results. And it is a match where it's in the quintillions or quadrillions. So you repeat the statistic for every victim. And so you keep hitting that number home with the jury. And as you go through it, you can see their face change. Like, okay, the first one, the second one, the third one, and we do it for 10 victims. And you can see their face is getting harder and harder with each one. So they convicted him for 10 victims and one unborn child.
After you get off the stand, what happens?
So I'm excused. I head back to the prosecutor's office because it was almost time for the lunch break, I believe, and so I was going to wait for her and to make sure she didn't need anything else from me. And so I waited for her in her office. And so while I was waiting, the investigator on the case was like, hey, I want to show you something. And I said, oh, okay. He's like, let me show you this video. And I was like, sure. So I walk over to the computer and I kind of lean over his shoulder and I'm looking at the computer, and it's a grainy black and white security image. And I was like, what is this? He goes, this is video footage of the parking garage where one of our victims was murdered. And I go, oh. He goes, yeah, this is like some of the best evidence we have in this case. I go, oh, okay. So he lets it play. And I could see the man that was sitting 15 feet from me at the table. He was on top of a woman on the ground outside of a parking garage. And I could see her struggling. And he had his hand on her windpipe, and he was actively raping her while killing her at the same time. And you could see her struggling. And then you could see her stop. You saw it stop. You saw her hand just drop. You could see the life leaving her. And I had no idea I was going to see something like that. I had no idea what I was going to see. And that moment really, this was 13 years ago, and I'm tearing up over thinking about it. And maybe at the time, I think it's actually over time, it's gotten harder to think about. Because at the time, you know, I'm young, I'm this forensic scientist who's testifying in this big case, and at the time it was horrifying. And you're like, oh my gosh, I've never seen anything like that. And we see horrible things on TV. You know, I watch Game of Thrones. Like, it's a horrible, bloody mess. But then it's not the same as when you see this person you saw 15 feet away from you raping and killing somebody. You know, at the time, it's horrifying. And then it's almost like that moment kind of cracked me open a little to this big picture that I'm a little piece of, where I am the scientist. I need to go in unbiased. I need to go in and just give the facts. But it's so important. It's important to her family. And so it kind of unleashes like this passion where I need to do my job well, and I need to do it right, and I need to do it in a way that's fair. But seeing that video has changed me as a scientist and just a person.
Beth, some of the victims were prostitutes. Do you think that played any role in why it took so long to link Chester-Turner to the murders?
Yeah, I mean, I think once again, that's also unfortunately not unusual in these types of cases and cases dealing with serial killers, because you have to remember, for the serial killers to become a serial killer, that means they have to be getting away with it for a long period of time. And so these crimes are planned, practiced, they hunt their victims, so they look for vulnerable victims, And a lot of the victims in the Chester Turner case and the Michael Hughes case and the Grim Sleeper case, the women were mostly prostitutes because those were the women who made for easy prey for a serial killer like Chester Turner, because you're talking about a lot of those murders occurred during the 80s when there was a crack cocaine epidemic going on in South LA. A lot of women became very addicted to this drug. It was highly addictive. And some of those women became so addicted that they were, basically willing to give up everything just to find their next fix, and that included jobs, marriages, family, kids. And so they were out on the streets, and so that made them super vulnerable because these were the type of women who would be willing to go into, like, let's say, a dark alley with somebody who was offering them cocaine, or get into a car, as was the case with Lonnie Franklin, and be willing to exchange, sex perhaps in order to get the drugs in this case, because, they were so overwhelmed by the crack cocaine addiction at that time. So that actually all plays into what made these victims such perfect prey, so to speak, for a monster like Chester Turner.
What's interesting to me is that there's such an age range between the 10 victims. You have 24, 26, 27, 29, 31, 45. Right. So it's not as if he was looking for one particular thing. I mean, do you think he was just looking for opportunity?
Yes, and like I said, he's also looking for easy victims. So, any of those victims that turned up in the areas where he was hunting, within his own communities, and I think, again, we saw that to some degree also with Sam Little, another serial killer who actually not just the age range as we saw with Chester Turner or with the Grim Sleeper, but also in terms of race. It's about opportunity, but it's also about trying to find the type of victims, and back to Tracy's point, that are easy prey, but also perhaps victims that these particular serial killers who are not stupid, that understand politics and, the laws of the hood, that these would be women perhaps that maybe people wouldn't be so quick to investigate. I think that's been, for me at least, an eye-opening experience over the last 13 years in handling several of these kinds of cases and seeing that and seeing how, that affects the community and the family lines from the victims going down 30-plus years.
What did the killer treat you like in the courtroom? What was he like?
I'm one of those people that I don't know if you can say it's because I'm jaded or because I'm old or because I just don't pay that much attention. I don't spend a lot of time looking across the table when I'm in trial. I find myself very engaged on the task at hand. That would be the witness in front of me, the jury to my right, whatever evidence I'm trying to present. And so I didn't really pay too much attention to Chester Turner. I mean, he's a big dude. He's got a big nasty scar across one cheek. I knew going in, obviously, what kind of a person Chester Turner was, and he's intimidating. But I also had a fabulous detective who I've worked with on a number of these cases, Detective Darren Dupree, who was sitting next to me during this trial. And I don't think I really paid too much attention to Chester Turner until sentencing, when I looked across at him during sentencing, and it looked like he was going to jump out of his chair, and so my detective kind of stood up in between us. And then I thought to myself, I'm glad he's going away forever, and I'll never have to see him again.
He got the death penalty, is that correct?
He's gotten it twice. Mm-hmm. That he's been sentenced to death. Let me say it that way. He hasn't gotten the death penalty, and I don't know how much people that listen to these podcasts are aware, but there's a moratorium on the death penalty in the state of California. We have over 740 people sitting on death row. It takes decades and decades for all of the appeals to run, and California still has no lethal injection protocol.
Beth, this case still haunts Jody so much. What haunts you about this case?
Well, like I said, I think it's the fact when you just see, it's that ripple effect, I think, that people don't get if you don't do these kinds of cases. We get it to some degree in any murder case where we understand that when somebody's murdered, there's an impact to that person's family and friends. But when you can fill up an entire courtroom with family and friends, and there's so, everybody you look at is another victim's family, and then how it kind of transfers down generations where, maybe a granddaughter or a great-granddaughter isn't allowed to walk home from school because of what happened to her grandmother, who she never met because she was brutally raped and murdered, and how that impacts the whole family. I think that's the thing that you don't really get over when you handle these kinds of cases, is just seeing, how many lives are destroyed, and that feeling that you get as either a law enforcement officer or as a prosecutor, that you can do everything within your power. You can do it perfectly. You can be super experienced. You can be super cautious and careful. You can get the right result. And at the end of the day, you get that, that verdict, and you get the sentencing done, and you feel like a breath. Finally you get to take up that breath and feel like you've really done your job, and then you turn around and you look at all these people, and their lives are still just as destroyed as they were the first day you met them. So I think for me, that's the part that you take home with you, that you don't really get over.
Beth, you absolutely fascinate me. I know when you talk about, you don't know if you're jaded or not. I did 28 years in law enforcement, so it definitely grinds you down.
Grinds you down to powder if you let it.
Yes, it does. You speak with such passion still after.
That's so funny that you guys say things like that, because I, say to my boss all the time, I think I'm getting too old for this. Like, I've got like this detached vitreous in my eye right now, where I can't, and bleeding on my retina, and the eye doctor's saying, oh, it's, comes with age, and, it's harder to get up every day, and your patience level runs out for dealing with people who just, you can't, I know you guys get it, and it's so much more fun to talk to people who get it, especially when you talk about somebody who was a female law enforcement officer for 28 years. I mean, geez.
So let me ask you this last question. An LAPD robbery homicide detective comes into your office and says, I just caught a serial killer. How would you feel about that?
My thing would be, okay, let's see what you got. Listen, I might be old and I might be tired and all that stuff, but I'm still a little bit, I'm still a little bit excited by the idea that we use such powerful forensic tools these days to solve cases that have been dead for 20, 30 years. There's still something about that, and being able to reach out to a family, which I had happen actually a week and a half ago on another case with an elderly lady who was, she wasn't that elderly, but elderly enough that she was put into an assisted living facility because she had had a massive stroke, and that family was hoping that they would take good care of her, and they did, but can't account for, again, a violent criminal who breaks in the middle of the night through a sliding door that's unlocked and beats her, rapes her, sodomizes her, and murders her. And, you have those kids who are now adults themselves. They were adults then, but now they're, even older. And, they've been waiting all these years to hear that the person that did this to their mother was caught, and he's going to be punished. I mean, how can you not be excited about that?
So my criminal law professor used to say that people think society is going to put a bow on a package at the end of the verdict and make everything cleaned up.
Exactly.
And it doesn't. But I can tell you, listening to you from one trial lawyer to another, from Gina and all the cases she's done, to answer your question, if you still have it as far as the passion, when you describe the families in the courtroom, I think people think we celebrate when we win. And when you said we don't, because it's not over, that means you still know exactly why you're doing what you're doing, and you still have your purpose. And it's an honor to have you as a colleague in this profession.
Oh, well, that's such a sweet thing, but it's just wonderful to see two strong women with such experience doing what you're doing right now, which is, trying to, in these days, which is super difficult given the sentiment against law enforcement and prosecutors, explain to people, what really does happen behind the crime itself and how it does impact the families and friends and then the community and then the greater society beyond that.
Okay, Gina, she is my people.
She's all of our people.
When she talks about the sadness after a verdict, I think people don't realize that. I think they think that prosecutors, we have some sort of party afterwards, or that, and we have the pressure of the victims' lives and honoring them on our shoulders. And when you're done, after all the work, the violent crime still happened. You can't take it back. Mm-hmm. And that's the part that always haunts me about the cases I've done.
Well, what I loved about her is you can tell, I remember right before I retired, I was exhausted. You give so much every single solitary day, but then she thinks, she's tired. But then when you ask her, okay, would you take another serial killer case? You could just hear the passion in her voice and being excited about going back into court and doing it all over again.
And I love how two strong women solved this case together, and they're using the science. The science is helping us so much in these difficult times solve cases and find people and exonerate people too. I'm very excited about both Beth and Jody's passion and how much they fight for crime victims.
Thanks to Beth and Jody for being on the show today. And please follow us on Twitter at Behind the Crime 2.
And subscribe to us through your local podcast provider.
And we'll see you next time Behind the Crime Scene.
Behind the Crime Scene with Gina Osborne and Tracy Miller is produced and edited by Lisa Osborne. Theme music is Insomnia by retired IRS Special Agent Clarissa Balmaceda. Find us on social media through BehindTheCrimeScene.com. And don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Behind the Crime Scene with Gina Osborne and Tracy Miller wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Lisa Osborne.